Jason, you wanted to respond to that last point?
Yeah, just, a lot of this conversation is obviously revolving around this question of whether or not an emissions trading system under a greenhouse gas target is more efficient and more cost-effective than having a multiple targets approach. And the benefit of having a multiple targets approach, including renewable energy, and renewables targets are popular around the world, and they're really gaining ground around the world, is that it's clear. It provides you a clear signal. It provides a signal of intent to industry. It provides a clear direction of travel. Emissions trading has a role, particularly in shorter-term trade-offs for industries that are very capable to understand how to work in that system. But it's not a very clear signal to the long term, to particularly communities that aren't as intimately involved with the covered facilities, for example, the financial community and policymakers around the different countries. So I think, for example, what's the role of a European renewable energy target? If we know that we're going to decarbonize and one of the main ways we're going to do that is with renewable energy, then why do you need the target? I mean, it's a perfectly legitimate conversation to have. But I think if we look at the motivation that the renewable energy target has provided to date, there are many countries, and I live in one here in Belgium, that would not have had the conversation about renewable energy if it didn't have a binding target. What does a binding target do? It means that when that thing lands on the bureaucrat's desk who has to implement the thing, he goes, ooh, binding target. I'm going to put that point 1 on my list of things to do. Energy efficiency target, not binding. That moves down the list. They've got way too much stuff to do. That's just a minor and flippant example of the way that increases this on the agenda for people, but it also is clear for the population that understands that this is a European commitment. It's a commitment in a single European energy market towards a direction of travel that we can invest in and that we can believe in.
Do you have another question from the audience? Go ahead. Oh, sorry. Go to Mike.
Yes, thank you. Jan Venik from Euromet on ferrous metals. I would just like to basically continue where Mr. Benschop ended, basically, because in my view, the ETS came into, or is in these troubles because the focus was only on the one side of the meaning of ETS, meaning CO2 reduction and cost effectiveness, which in my view is basically competitiveness. And in that sense, I would say, and that's the question as well, in these discussions when we develop 2030, the industry could maybe expect from the Commission to have some targets on the other side as well. Meaning, could we have a legally binding target for industrial growth in Europe?
It's an interesting prospect. Does Europe need a target for economic or industrial growth?
Would it work if we had one? I mean, would it deliver because we've got one? No, I mean, I think what I would say in the context of competitiveness and the ETS, which was the instrument you mentioned, the sectors that are exposed to third country competition are allocated free allowances under the ETS in the phase 3, the current phase. And until now, in phases 1 and 2, they've been given free to everybody. Now, just think about it. I mean, no, okay, maybe not some of the new sector, aluminium and so on, but I'm just saying, you're going to get free allowances. That's to take account of competitiveness concerns. That was the decision the legislator made. And for much of industry, and I extend this to the audience more generally, they've been given free allowances beyond their actual needs. In fact, for the second phase, the figures that were circulating about 10 days ago showed that the free allocation made to those energy-intensive sectors has actually been greater than their actual emissions. So they've got a surplus in their pocket, a big surplus collectively in the ETS as a whole. So tell me how we have impaired competitiveness if we've given to the industry more than they need, so they've been able to comply for free, and that the surplus has perhaps been monetized by industry. In some cases, I know it has. ArcelorMittal sold quite a lot of allowances last year. So, history doesn't predict the future. I understand, it's the future that matters. But so far, all the stories about ETS having impaired competitiveness of European industry needs to be substantiated, because the evidence suggests that the evidence that I can see is that the ETS has given them benefits rather than costs. I leave it there.
Romana, you wanted to respond to that?
Yes, just a short comment. I believe you that there are some problems with surplus of free allowances made by, I don't know, European Commission or national governments. However, when we are talking about competitiveness, it's not only about production processes. Yes, different companies have this, get these free allowances for emissions of their production processes, but we have to be competitive also as a society. If that same energy-intensive industries should pay for electricity or other energy sources 4 times more than their competitors in the United States, then they are hardly competitive enough, even if they get some allowances free for their production. So
Okay.
this is the main problem we are discussing in the connection with backloading, for example.
Fair enough. And I think that debate is ongoing. First of all, there are very wide differences in electricity prices within Europe between the member states. So they've all got the same ETS, but they have different electricity prices. So questions need to be asked, why? What are the drivers for electricity prices? The Commission is committing to look into what those drivers are. And there are manifold. And I think that the contribution of the ETS has been very, very modest. And I think that, you know, it is rather a misdiagnosis. I really think that if the troubles of the European industry's competitiveness are being put down to the ETS, then I fear that the industry's misdiagnosing their problems, and that, you know, if you were to take the ETS away completely, it wouldn't really solve the problems of industry. So look at the, you know, it needs analysis in the cold light of day. And there is a bit of a mantra going around Brussels that, you know, it's the ETS, it's the ETS. But I think this is being overplayed. And I hope that this analysis that the Commission is going to make is going to be able to substantiate exactly what it is that ETS has contributed among all the other factors: transportation of electricity and the efficiencies of competition within member states, price regulation,
Taxation.
Yeah,
well,
that's also.
those are, don't expect Brussels to come and solve tax harmonization. It's not an area we've got a track record in. But I think taxation is extremely important in the big picture. But I mean, you can look as much at corporate taxation and talk about how much profits from European industries are taken away by governments. Is that impairing their competitiveness? These are the questions.
Well, just to build on that, I mean, if you look at comparisons between Europe and North America over the last few years, in which the price of natural gas and electricity has fallen in North America, the actual energy as a factor of production in Europe and North America has been very similar. It's been actually tracking across the same line, and the increase in cost export prices due to energy because of as a factor of production for export for the U.S. has gone up by 12%, and in Europe has gone up by 8% over the last 10 years. And one of the main reasons for this is that Europe has been making steady progress on energy efficiency, and that one of the ways that, for example, a recent report by the European Council for Energy Efficient Economy points out that actually, you know, the idea that Europe is somehow magically going to reduce its energy costs for a whole host of structural reasons is one that we might think about, but where we really have our competitive advantage is in energy savings. And that's the way that we're going to reduce energy costs, not energy prices as a unit, but energy costs as a unit of production, and also to households. And that's where our real advantage is.
Sam, you had a question over
here. Yeah, I was at an event earlier with Commissioner Oettinger, and there was a big focus on harmonisation of renewable support schemes. It was about the contribution of the Eastern Mediterranean to energy security. And one of the things that Commissioner Oettinger said was that it would be great if schemes could be harmonised in such a way that German companies could invest in solar production in Greece, i.e. where it's most cost effective to do so. It's a question, I suppose, for Peter, but is the Commission prepared to come out with something bold on harmonisation of renewable support schemes? And it's kind of the same question another way, but what do you think the political chances are of improving the situation?
Thanks, Simon. First thing is you're making me talk off my portfolio, but it was my last job to promote the renewable energy in the last mandate and the energy targets and so on. What I would just say is that it is today, under the existing legislation, possible for Germany to invest in solar panels in Greece or whichever country it was you gave as an example, and for those production from renewable energy to count towards Germany's target or to be shared. It's all to be negotiated between government to government, but it can be done. There are what they call the cooperation mechanisms within the existing framework. And quite honestly, the member states are not choosing to use them. And it's obviously because what they would prefer, and I would say that we too in the last mandate thought, can we get a harmonized support scheme for renewables? It would be much more cost effective to put the solar panels where the sun is shining and the wind up where the wind is. But the member states didn't want that. So you've got a barrier to overcome. The ambassadors left, but I mean, there's 27 other member states as of the 1st of July. They need to know, they can decide or not whether to do this or not. But there is, of course, within the minds of governments, the idea, the rather comfortable idea that if they support renewable energies, it creates jobs and it counts to their, it creates wealth for them if those investments are on their territory. There's a kind of territorialism about the renewable energy. They pay and they want the benefits to be to their local communities. But if you look at it from a cost-effective point of view, of course, you have to look across the borders. But it is possible under the existing legislation. And, you know, I think there's got to be a can-do mentality by the governments. They've got to go and, you know, talk to each other and try and make these things happen because they could save money. But at the moment, there's this sort of mindset where, yes, Germany has high feed-in tariffs, but those feed-in tariffs benefit deployment of renewable energy in Germany. But of course, if you look at it bigger than that, you know, if there were to be solar panels deployed in Greece and Spain, the chances are those would largely be still manufactured in Germany or in China, as the case may be. But it's not as if it's a net loss because it's going somewhere else in the community. But there is still the national mindset, if you like, that we could work within under existing legislation, but we could indeed try to go further, and I think that's what Günther Oettinger has talked about earlier today. Thanks.
Well, I won't dare ask you about those Chinese solar panels, but
Please,
I think we have time for one more question, if anybody else has one. Sure.
Thank you. My name is Peter Wojcik with the European chemical industry. I think to supplement to what Peter Wiss said, the situation is even more complex. It's not only the governments, the national governments, but it's even the regional governments. When you look at Germany, it's, for instance, Rhineland-Palatia that has the idea of increasing the renewables share to an extent that its capacity will support more than 150% of the own consumption without looking around, well, who will buy this electricity? And the same is true for Germany, which then has created enormous overload of capacity and of electricity, which then needs to be sold to a negative cost. So basically, Germany has to pay other countries to take this electricity. And it's all financed through feed-in tariffs. So there is a lot wrong. And if I could answer to Sandrine's question, what is missing is reality, realism. So all the assumptions that were the basis of the 2020 targets, many of them have proven wrong. So there is no exploding fossil fuel price. There is no global agreement until now. We have an enormous economic crisis. So we have to rethink. And my opinion is we need to revise the policies. And maybe there will be in future less time for sunshine travel with the commissioner to nice places. But we have to see, well, what is wrong here and what can we correct? And energy policy is certainly where we need to start, an industry policy, rather than trying to fix the ETS. We cannot make the ETS responsible for everything. If the energy markets don't work, then we need to fix the energy markets. We cannot blame it on the ETS. Thank you.
I mean, maybe that's a good kind of final question, not to keep barraging you with questions, Peter, but in terms of looking at what went wrong in the 2020 targets, what parts of, not that everything went wrong, but what parts of it didn't work, and we look at the renewables targets, we look at what's happened with subsidies, which I think the Commission would admit that not everything is perfect there. What lessons can be learned specifically for that renewables targets, and how, taking account of how things have changed since 2008?
Well, first of all, I would say things have changed, and I fully acknowledge, and indeed the Green Paper, the 2030 Green Paper says this framework for 2030 must be sufficiently ambitious to ensure the EU is on track to meet its long-term climate change objectives, but it must also reflect a number of important changes that have taken place since the original framework was agreed in 2008. So, I mean, no one is saying the world hasn't changed. We're certainly not saying that. On the contrary, we're saying the world has changed. But you know what? We weren't the only ones who didn't foresee this economic crisis. We don't have perfect foresight. Fukushima has happened. The German government decided to withdraw from nuclear. I mean, those were important changes. But, I mean, don't come to Brussels, Peter. You're in Brussels, I know. I see you regularly. And say, why didn't you see all that, Commissioner? I mean, you know, the world is unpredictable, but we're trying to provide some stable framework in which you businesses who are living in this unpredictable world can better operate from the regulatory context point of view. On the renewables targets, which I take full ownership for my past work, and indeed I still maintain that that is the right policy to have done. What is it that's not working? What's happening is that in some member states, they're realizing that their feed-in tariffs were more than they could afford, perhaps, or more than they realized they would be. I don't know. But those were not fixed in Brussels. Those are the national decisions. Other member states are doing much better, and they haven't been paying so highly. So, I mean, again, people come rushing to us and say, what are you going to do about it? Well, the answer is go back, talk to your governments about what they can do about it. And of course, in that context, I think it would be very useful if people did look more at the sort of cost-effective potential of these cooperation mechanisms. But I'm glad anyway, Peter, that you think that the ETS isn't responsible for all the world's ills. That's a very encouraging message. Thank you.
I take you had a thought on that as well?
No, I think there's right issues being put on the table. We talk now about target setting and the energy mix and how to reach climate objectives in the most cost-effective way. But you already see that in the electricity sector, the issue has moved on as well to how does the electricity sector functions as a system. So it's not about individual contributions anymore, but how do we maintain a well-functioning electricity system with the intermittency, with the overload issues, with the interconnectivity. So that's currently vigorously being addressed. And the next one after that, if you see also with not all the policies from Brussels functioning. You see a renationalization happening in policy making as well. And it all leads into one direction, that is that you can even ask the question, will we have a power market left in the end, or will we be back to the previous situation where everything has been set in terms of price levels and subsidies. And you could see the UK, which on the one is a bit at the forefront of things happening policy-wise and developing policies. But if you add everything up that is happening there, you could argue there's no power market left in the end. So we start with climate target setting, then you get into the system issue, which really has to be addressed, and how do we do that? And then you end up in a discussion about markets. We still, from a Brussels perspective, think, yeah, we are finalizing finally the end of the packages, and the market will be there, it fully will be there. But by a host of other policies in the meantime, you could even argue that the electricity market is going to be something of the past if we're not careful.
Okay. I think with that we can wrap up for tonight and head out to the drinks reception. Just to kind of conclude here tonight, I think the takeaway that I would get from this is a lot of how people are viewing the possibilities for 2030 depends on whether you think the 2020 targets worked. Was it smart to set the renewables target as it did, as it was in terms of the subsidies, subsidy problems that have gone wrong in the member states? What's the origin of that? And with efficiency, the fact that we don't have a binding efficiency target, was it reasonable to expect one in 2008 that didn't materialize when there wasn't the political will for it? This conversation is definitely not going to end anytime soon, but we may have somewhat of an answer by the end of the year. So I want to thank you all very much for coming. Just a couple of announcements. You all have feedback forms on your chairs. We'd really appreciate it if you could fill those out so you can let us know how we can improve, and you let us know what we're doing well, what we're not. There's also a poll inside your programs, which would be great if you could fill out those. The results of that poll will be posted on the Comet Visions website. You can also continue this discussion online at cometvisions.com. It'll be the same question that we posed in tonight's debate, except in an online debate forum where people can debate virtually. And with that, I'd like to have a round of applause for our panel members.
Thank you very much, Dave.
Thank you all very much for coming.